Colleagues, it's now 2 minutes past 12. I think we will start our noon meeting. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining our noon meeting in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine. This particular session is being hosted by the Occupational Medicine Division in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine. For today's presentation, we are very fortunate to have Professor Rodney Ehrlich, who will be speaking on researching occupational TB in minors, looking at issues of causation to more contemporary issues in terms of computer-aided X-ray diagnosis. For those of you who don't know Prof. Ehrlich, Prof. Ehrlich was the previous head of the Occupational Medicine Division in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine, and he was also the director of the Occupational Medicine Clinic at Grootskia Hospital. Since his retirement, Rodney has been a senior scholar in our Occupational Medicine Division, and he has continued to contribute academically as well as to provide support to the Occupational Medicine Division. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Rodney to do his presentation. Can I suggest that everyone have their mics on mute, and you could, after Rodney's presentation, you can either post your question on the chat, in which case I will read it out, or if you would like to ask your question, then raise your hand and I will give you an opportunity to ask your question. This session will end at 1 p.m. So thanks, and over to Rodney.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks for this opportunity. It's nice to get together with some old colleagues and friends, some whom I've seen recently, others not for a long time. And I notice many names I'm not familiar with. Welcome. I'm pleased that you found the subject interesting enough to join. So I'm going to start the presentation with what I've called a prologue. I want to talk about two areas of research that I've been involved in over the last couple of years. One is a long-standing question about the relationship between silica and tuberculosis, and that is the causation part of the title. I'm actually going to present work that's already been published. But secondly, I'm going to present some work which is still in progress, although there are some publications, and that is in the use of computer-aided detection, artificial intelligence, in the diagnosis of, or the detection of tuberculosis in the mining sector. But I think it's useful, particularly for people who may not have that much familiarity with the role of mining and occupational disease in South African history, to give what I call a brief prologue to these questions. And one really needs to understand history, and what's occurred to me, they say that history comes to people in retirement. That's such a pity, because it seems that many of the analyses we make of in public health and even occupational health are what one would call ahistorical, and that if one brings in the historical dimension of time, it provides so much more explanatory power for what we're seeing in front of us. And the mining industry, I think, is a prime example of this. So gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand in 1886, and I would say, one could say, I think, confidently, that really initiated modern South Africa. So we don't know how many men, and they were mainly men, passed through the gold mining industry in the past 135 years, but I think we can confidently say it was in the millions. We have, however, a much more accurate figure from work we did in recent years using the recruiting company database. And to the gold mining industry alone, it was 1.2 million between 1973 and 2013. Most were migrants. And until the 1970s, more than half of the migrant miners came from neighboring countries, particularly Lesotho, Mozambique, lesser extent Eswatini and Botswana. More of that as we go on. This is really just a picture of the routes that came, and you can see mainly it's miners moving from, or migrant workers moving from the eastern part of the southern continent, from the Eastern Cape, Lesotho, Eswatini, and southern Mozambique into the mining areas of the Witwatersrand and later the Northern Free State, but increasing in recent years. And this really covers platinum mining as well, from what we'd call, I suppose, the Northwest. However, this trajectory has not been, has been a sort of somewhat disruptive and has shown very sharp changes. So this is a picture of the annual employment on a large gold mining company between 1973 and 2018.
Yeah,
okay, now it's,
yeah.
Okay, and you can see it in full screen. Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, right. So between 1970, and this is important, between 1970 and 1990, there was a massive intake of novices, new miners, into this particular gold mining company. And this is the same picture for the industry as a whole, from about 60,000 to 250,000 novices. But in fact, it was 500,000 men working on the gold mine, other people who were returning in 1990. Since then, there's been an almost symmetrical decline in the size of the industry. And it included policy to stop taking on novices, so that the number now employed in the industry, figure that we have at this company, is about 45,000. For the industry as a whole, possibly 80, 90,000. Concomitant to this was a decline in the proportion of what I call cross-border miners, from about half in the 1970s to only a quarter in recent years. By the last decade of the 20th century, the black, mainly migrant gold miner population was afflicted with a triple epidemic of silicosis, tuberculosis, and HIV infection. So the purpose of the prologue was really to bring us up to date and give us a sense, because it's what gives me the sense and the confidence that these are important questions in public health in South Africa and indeed globally. Okay. So the first research I want to present is a systematic review of the relationship between silica dust exposure, which is the main dust, the hazardous dust in gold mining, silicosis, the disease due to silica, and tuberculosis. Updating the causal relationship, and I acknowledge my co-authors. David Rees, I think, is on the Zoom meeting, Nandi Siegfried, who's expert in systematic reviews, and Paula Akugizigwe, who is a Master's of Public Health student in our department 5 years ago, and she used this topic for her MEd, and we built the systematic review on the work that she started. So besides the prologue, what is the relevance globally? Well, there's still huge numbers of workers occupationally exposed to silica. All the mining sectors, the extractive industries, they're called, construction, foundries, iron foundries, ceramics and engineered stone, and indeed in agriculture as well. Many of these populations are in high TB burden countries, particularly many of these silica exposed populations are in fact in high TB burden countries as defined by the World Health Organization, particularly in numbers: China, India, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. Interestingly, these are the BRICS countries, for what it's worth, and also Indonesia, another massive country. So globally, co-exposure to respirable silica dust and MTB are common. However, having sort of kept a close watch on publications from all the above countries and other countries, it strikes me that the relationship between silica and tuberculosis is an underappreciated and under-researched subject, and not without controversy. Jock McCulloch, who's the late Jock McCulloch, who has done written a book on the history of silica, and hopefully there'll be a post-mortem book coming out on the history of TB, in the South African mines had shown how there was resistance within the industry, not from all the from the medical commentators, not all, but a few, strong resistance to the idea that there was any causal link between silica, silicosis, and tuberculosis. And this was really a public health problem which happened to collide with the gold mining industry, and that was a burden too for the gold mining industry. Right. Yes, I was talking about resistance to the idea of a causal association, and I think that's one of the main reasons that stimulated this work, but also its general neglect in the global literature is, I think, is something that required attention. And there are people other people who weren't part of this particular work that have been involved with this question for a long time. So why a systematic review now? Well, in fact, since 1970, there's actually been only one non-systematic review of the subject. That's between the association between TB, tuberculosis, and silicosis and tuberculosis, and that was from Brazil. However, there have been a number of reviews of the relationship of silica and silicosis as an occupational hazard, including authoritative reviews by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in the US, and a number of other organizations, a number of authoritative occupational groups. The TB section is always thin. It's based on a type of a grab bag of studies that have been done. There's no quality assessment. A lot of the studies have been mortality studies rather than disease incidence studies. The problem with mortality studies is that it may not necessarily be a causal link between silica and disease, but rather between silica and working in mining and mortality, and there are selection effects and diagnostic problems. And so one cannot rely only on mortality studies, although they point in the same direction. However, and the other notion which is missing really is something that we've worked on and in fact published on 2018. I'll give the reference at the end of this section, and that a large proportion of the disease silicosis is not apparent on the chest X-ray. And this has profound implications for an understanding of the relationship between silica dust, silicosis, and tuberculosis. I'll come back to that. Okay, so the objectives of our systematic review was to look at the association between TB and silicosis, and secondly, silica exposure controlling for silicosis. So we really wanted to try and separate, they are both in the causal pathway, obviously. Silica exposure leads to silicosis, leads to tuberculosis, is the hypothesis. However, the argument that was made, say in somehow to mitigate or attenuate the importance of the association, was that it's only when silicosis appears is there an association. However, the association between dust and tuberculosis itself is not causal. It requires the disease or the mediating effect of the disease silicosis. We wanted to try and pick these two apart and see if we could come to a conclusion. And a secondary objective was to see if there was a threshold of effect by the disease or exposure relationships. So most of the reviews regard tuberculosis, and the reviews generally accept the association. It's a complication of silicosis, but more attention is paid to lung cancer, which is of great interest in mostly in developed countries, and to autoimmune disease, rare, but not for people affected, important effects, but certainly rare. What I regard as the most important impact of silica and silicosis is regarded as as I said, as a complication, and not something that should be examined for its preventability, which would require understanding the exposure-response relationships and the threshold of effect between silica dust and tuberculosis. That's entirely missing. We followed the, under Nandy's Siegfried's expert guidance, all the steps required for a systematic review, and there are many. The protocol was registered on the International Register, Prospero. We followed the PRISMA guide. I'm not going to expand the acronyms because I can't remember it offhand. We used two databases, PubMed and Embase. We used the Newcastle Ottawa scale for risk of bias assessment. This is a scale that's being developed or in development for the systematic review of observational studies of hazardous effect. And finally, we used grade for the assessment of our degree of confidence in the effect estimate. So if you're unfamiliar with systematic reviews, some of this will be very arcane, but if you're going to get involved in systematic reviews, you have to read them, then you probably have some passing familiarity. And I should say that one of the things that I learned was that, or realized, was that the methodology for systematic review of observational studies of causation, particularly in occupational environmental health, is underdeveloped and somewhat contestable. For example, all studies start at high risk of bias, and in a sense of all observational studies start at a high risk of bias. And it really reflects within the system the origins of systematic reviews and meta-analysis in randomized controlled trials. And it's a type of dialectic that is quite interesting, and it's actually been played out in the research literature, methodological literature, if you're interested. We wanted to focus on incident tuberculosis, so we included only case control and cohort studies, and tuberculosis incidence as an outcome with the diagnostic method specified, and the exposures were either silicosis, the attribute, state of the disease, or silica exposure temporarily prior to tuberculosis, also with the diagnostic method or exposure metric specified. We therefore excluded case series, surveillance reports, of which there are many, mortality studies, I've commented on that, and cross-sectional studies. I mean, we've published with some of the people on this call, cross-sectional studies, but we decided, given the prevalence incidence bias and the selection bias and the problem of temporality, we would leave them out. We found 9 studies. I'm going to not go through all the steps of systematic review because they are quite tedious, and for those interested, the reference will be in a forthcoming slide. We found 9 studies, one from Hong Kong, one from Taiwan, one from Denmark, Sweden, and Iran, and 5 from South Africa. This is the risk of bias matrix that emerges from using the Newcastle Ottawa quality assessment tool. There's one for cohort studies, and there's one for case control studies, cohort studies to the left, as you look at it, and cohort studies to the right. Green means low risk of bias, yellow question mark means uncertain risk of bias, and red means high risk of bias. In fact, what we found is, what we concluded, is that it was really the problem of confounding or comparability between the exposure groups that was common to actually all the studies. So uncertain risk of bias when it came to the ability of these studies to control for confounding. The others were few and tended to be distributed between 2 or 3 studies. And the potential confounders clearly, or actually not so clearly, the potential confounders for the association between silica and tuberculosis are age as a variable of risk factor for tuberculosis in the literature, HIV, very powerful risk factor and associated with mining certainly. A whole group of variables which all in a sense linked to socioeconomic status. That includes congregate settings, which is another term for crowding, crowding in your living circumstances, crowding in transport, and crowding in the workplace. Undernutrition, probably less important in mining. Indoor air pollution, there are other pollutants in mining. Smoking is a risk factor for tuberculosis. Heavy alcohol use, and increasingly of interest is diabetes. So we looked at all the studies. I'm not going to present the outcome of that particular investigation. It is in the supplementary material to this article, and we concluded that the risk of bias in studies which used internal controls for, in other words, the same mining population, was the likelihood of confounding, explaining the effect, was low. However, when a general population was used as the unexposed control, the risk of confounding rose. I'm going to move immediately to the meta-analysis. Here we have, and it's stratified by low tuberculosis burden country. There were 5 studies, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Iran, Denmark and Sweden, and 4 from high tuberculosis burden countries, all South African. The meta-analytic summary relative risk was approximately 4, which is high, and heterogeneity was moderate. If you look at the I-squared as a metric for heterogeneity and consistency between the studies, moderate at 53%. There was one strong outlier study, and that was the Swedish study by Westerholm, 1986, which also had other methodological problems. It had a relative risk of 33. If one excludes that study, it's not shown here, but the meta-analytic relative risk falls to about 3.7, and the I-squared to about 45%. So there's a moderate reduction in I-squared. However, we concluded from this that there was a strong association between, and a relatively consistent association between silicosis and tuberculosis. Although high TB countries had a much higher relative risk than the low tuberculosis countries had a much higher relative risk than the high tuberculosis burden countries. In fact, it wasn't statistically significant. Because silicosis and ordinal can be graded on an ordinal scale from absent, mild, moderate, and severe, it can't really be handled by ordinary methods of meta-analysis, and so I'm presenting it graphically. So what this shows are using the same metric, which is silicosis grade, and because the languages differed a bit, some have used an international classification, yet some have used mild, moderate, severe, which accords, they can be aligned. I've used level 1, 2, 3, and 4. What you see here is really a consistent monotonic, in other words, an increase with every increment, relationship between the grade of silicosis and tuberculosis. 4 of these studies are South African, and 1 is from Hong Kong. So then we turned to looking at the studies, and there were fewer of them, only 5, in which we were able to control or either control for or remove, or sorry, we didn't remove. The study allowed us to remove the effect of silicosis. So here the relative risk was somewhat lower, 1.92, it was around 2, and heterogeneity was about the same as the previous meta-analysis, around 59%. Nevertheless, even when we can remove the effect of silicosis, there was a reasonably consistent effect on the on tuberculosis incidence to the extent of doubling. When it came to looking at the metrics that were used and their grading, there was no consistent metric. In other words, in dealing with the effect of silica dust, and this is one of the problems, most studies did not measure dust. In fact, there was only one study ever which has measured, a cohort study, which has measured cumulative dust, which is both the length of service and the intensity of silica exposure, and that's by Ivan Nijdo and others in a study of South African gold miners, 1998, and that's the second study presented here. And you can see a smooth monotonic effect for the increments in cumulative dust histograms. The other studies used either duration employed, which is somewhat misclassified, or binary categorical metrics such as a non-dusty versus dusty job, surface underground, no exposure, any exposure, and there's some inconsistency in a couple of these studies. Coming to the secondary effect, secondary objective, which was the threshold of effect. When we examined, and this won't be apparent to you, when we examined from the slide, the first increment in effect for silicosis, the effect was apparent at relatively low silicosis grade, using the International Labour Organization classification, which has uses numeric gradings. Even at the lowest level, the lowest or the first grade, which is the lowest level, 1/0, upward from there, an effect of increased risk was visible. And strikingly, in the study of Nijdo, they had subradiological, it was based on autopsy material. They were able to show that as the extent of autopsy silicosis increased, the risk of tuberculosis, also found at autopsy or recently in life, rose. So even at a subradiological level of silicosis, there is a signal of an increased risk of tuberculosis. And the reason that this is important, because one of the arguments, again, made in the sort of the risk attenuation school was that the effect of TB was only visible at very high grades of silicosis. And historically, as these high grades disappeared and most silicosis became early silicosis or mild silicosis, the TB effect disappeared with it. So we believe that this is not the case. When it came to silica controlling for silica dust, it's controlling for silicosis, we were not able to identify a threshold because the exposure metric either did not or was not sufficiently stratified by airborne silica concentration. And as I mentioned earlier, only one study could really have done this, but the increments there were too large, so we were not able to identify a specific exposure threshold for dust exposure threshold for the appearance of TB. So our main findings that we have high confidence, using the language of grade, in a strong association of silicosis to tuberculosis, a low threshold of effect. We have low confidence, using the grade language, in effect estimate for silica controlling for silicosis based on relatively few studies and using surrogate metrics for exposure. And in the grade system, indirectness, in other words, lack of direct measurement of exposure, we had indirect measurements, surrogates, and some inconsistency require a downgrading of your level of confidence. However, there are suggestive exposure-response relationships, and what I've not presented here are the other databases. The mortality database strongly suggests an association, and there is considerable biological plausibility from animal studies, most of them actually from the first half of the century, relatively few after 1970, and more recently from immunological studies, suggesting that silica has a specific and unique effect on the control of Mycobacterium tuberculosis at the macrophage and cytokine level. Threshold effect was not accessible. What are the implications, to end off? That and the recent interest in with political interest, should I say, with the World Assembly on tuberculosis and the declaration and the SADC declaration, that this is a timeless opportunity to, it has been timeless opportunity to put mining and silica dust exposure on the agenda as significant, not the major contributor at the population level, but in certain regions, certain sectors, significant contribution to tuberculosis risk and tuberculosis on transmission, and control of airborne silica should therefore be seen as part of the program or armamentarium control of tuberculosis public health setting. It also informs the policy or the particular legislation really governing the association between silica and tuberculosis. Specifically that, particularly given subradiological silicosis, that as in some jurisdictions, maybe most jurisdictions, it's not justifiable to require radiological silicosis for someone who's been heavily exposed to silica to justify a compensation for tuberculosis. In other words, we believe that occupational tuberculosis is an occupational disease in settings of high exposure, even when there is no silicosis on the X-ray. Research, this is a heavily under-researched area. China, India, Brazil, to a less extent Indonesia are sort of missing in action, if I can say that. We need surveillance of incident TB in silica-exposed populations. That is now happening in our mining industry. I'm not sure about anywhere else in the world. Specific surveillance. Cohort studies of silica exposure, measuring respirable silica dust concentrations. and also a better understanding of the role of silica and silicosis in radiological diagnosis, treatment success, and chemoprophylaxis of tuberculosis in silica-exposed workers' populations. I'll end that there. So I think, Mohammed, I'm going to push on with part 2 rather than allow for questions, or what should we do? I'll leave it to you.
I think, yes, please proceed. I think that will be fine. Thanks.
Okay. All right. These references are here for those interested. Okay, so now the change of, and I'm going to make this, well, I'm not, yeah, make it somewhat shorter. I'm going to digress less here. We've been working in recent years on seeing if we could apply computer-aided detection, or CAD, which has been developed for tuberculosis, to tuberculosis and silicosis in gold miners. So the WHO, the sort of world tuberculosis community, has returned in recent years to the chest X-ray as an important means for screening. That screening, screening and triage. I'll explain that in a minute. Screening and triage in the diagnosis or detection of tuberculosis in a global public health setting, using AI technology of CAD, which has been developed over a long period now, although it's, there's a lot more interest now. Screening is the X-raying of an unselected population, irrespective of presentation with symptoms or not. We would call that active screening, I think, in public health. And triage is the examination or the screening of people who have presented themselves or been referred with symptoms or other indication. And we would, I think, would call that passive screening. The South African mining industry occupational context, I've already explained. However, given our compensation laws and given what's happened in recent years, particularly the outreach of the legislative or statutory compensation authority in South Africa, and also the settling of a large class action lawsuit between with six mining companies for both tuberculosis and silicosis, there's been a huge expansion of both interest in and the need to examine, I don't know the numbers, but if we take the numbers we believe parts of the industry, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of mainly former miners. And again, that will be apparent from some of the data presented earlier. The two current agencies of interest are the Medical Bureau, or the agencies which fall under the Occupational Disease and Mines and Works Act, and they are responsible for directing or inviting or securing the medical examination of people who have been exposed, whether they were working or former miners, and also for the adjudication of these thousands of claims which are submitted consequent on those examinations. In the civil arena, the Chiamiso Trust is the agency or the vehicle that was set up following class action suit, and it has the same mandate. It's to really find, invite, examine, which includes X-rays, and adjudicate the claims for compensation for both tuberculosis and silicosis in active miners and former miners. So the question is really, computer-aided detection is an AI application to identify specific patterns on the plain chest X-ray image. It's based on the technology of AI technology of artificial neural networks and deep learning. I'll leave that to you to look up. I certainly don't have much deep understanding of that myself. It's been applied to tuberculosis with advances over time. For example, one of the pioneers in this area being the Delft company in the Netherlands, where this was developed, and they are on their 7th version of what they call CAD for TB, but there are other vendors, as you will see. It's now recommended by the WHO in their TB guidelines, 2020 and 21. It has not previously been applied to silicosis, nor to my knowledge, to any mining population. So the question is, how well does CAD identify tuberculosis in a population with competing disease on the chest X-ray? And this is the big conundrum. Gold miners have very high prevalences of previous tuberculosis, which leaves considerable I'll show you in a moment, in structural patterns of abnormality. And of course, they also have high prevalence of silicosis. How well does CAD identify silicosis? And really, it's the vice versa, given the high background rate of tuberculosis. And then one needs to contemplate what are the applications in which CAD would be useful in this setting. So I'm going to give you, I think it's important to understand the visual phenomena that we're dealing with. And I'm going to present very quickly some chest X-ray images just to give you an idea of the problem. That's what a normal chest X-ray should look like. You've got the heart in the middle, those not clinically inclined. You've got the blood vessels coming out in the center, but mainly it's air. Air is black, and what you're seeing, the sort of fluffy little bits, are blood vessels mainly. This is a gross example to make it clear on the X-ray. Silicosis like a snowstorm. These are really scarring or fibrotic nodules in the lung fields, interfering with the passage of the X-rays, and that's good going silicosis. Often it's not as easy to see as that. So this is poorly resolved film. Here you can see there's something going on in the left lung, and what in fact we're looking at is a filling of the left lung with tuberculosis disease and the formation of a cavity as the lung breaks down. And again, it's a fairly gross example, gives you an idea what tuberculosis looks like. So should be thinking now, how well can CAD identify this, and how does it compare to humans? So now it starts to get difficult. This is old tuberculosis, and in fact it too presents a pattern of scarring in both lungs, mainly in the upper zones, with rounded opacities of different sizes. And here it starts to get difficult. Some people might argue that there is probably silicosis here, but some others will come down, I think myself included here, that this is probably all old tuberculosis. But you can see the problem. It gets even worse when you have old tuberculosis. You have nodules everywhere, you have scar tissue, and you also have breakdown of tissue, suggesting there may well be other infections superimposed. So the point is that these are complex radiological decisions over which experienced clinical readers will argue. Enter CAD. So just some steps in the development of CAD. You need a source of chest X-ray images, ideally from the target population. You need a reference standard. Sometimes the term gold standard is used, but human readers are, they might be the best standard, but not necessarily gold, because there's so much sort of disagreement. Nevertheless, you need a reference standard for the CAD to be trained on. And with silicosis, it's only human reading. But with tuberculosis, you have in addition microbiological diagnosis using either expert technology, mainly microscopy on culture, mostly on sputum, although there are other sources, for example, biopsy for the diagnosis of tuberculosis. So these are the reference systems on which CAD is trained. First, you need the development or the training, and then you need the validation in the same target population, but not the same images used for training. You need reference standards, and the contexts may vary. I'm going to present some of the analysis, but I just want to identify what we're going to be looking at. First of all, you need to draw something called a receiver operating characteristic curve. And this is, I will show you, is the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity as numeric variables. So bear with me. You need to measure the area under the curve, which is the metric used to decide how well the CAD agrees with the reference standard. We then need to choose a threshold criterion from which we can derive sensitivity, which is the accuracy in avoiding false negatives, big net, catching as many positive cases as there are. That's sensitivity. And its complement, specificity, which is accuracy in avoiding false positives. So that's getting too many false positives into the net. We narrow the net, but then you will increase the risk of missing true positives. And the utility is always context dependent. Some of these hopefully become clear as we go. Okay, so this is a study that was done last year with 4 different CAD systems provided by different companies. And the y-axis you have sensitivity, the x-axis specificity. They are trade-offs. As sensitivity increases, specificity deteriorates. And the ROC, receiver operating characteristic curve, is really a convexity away from the median diagonal. And the closer it gets to the top left-hand corner, the greater the agreement between the CAD system and the reference value. And that's measured by literally by the area under the curve against the diagonal, which is no better than chance. And in fact, looking at these 4 vendors, 3 of them achieved very high agreement, 0.98, 0.96, 0.98, that's very high, and 1 somewhat less for the agreement between the ability of the CAD to determine, sorry, this is tuberculosis against normal, sorry, I should have explained. The reference system here is a radiologist plus a medical panel at the Medical Bureau for Occupational Diseases. So that was last year. However, we repeated the study, and this time we used external readers, did not use the MBAD panel. One of the CAD companies dropped out, and instead of using a pre-selected sample, we used a field sample from benefit medical examinations done for the MBAD in the Eastern Cape. And here the results are somewhat different. Only the 2 of the companies were able to achieve, and external readers, as I mentioned, only the 2 of the companies were able to achieve relatively high agreement area under the curve, the blue curve and the grey curve. The 3rd company, for some reason, we don't know what happened, but you can see that it sort of really fell out of contention. And now we need to calculate sensitivity and specificity. I'm going to speed up here a bit, and I'm going to move to a different criterion. So these are the same curves. We need a criterion to decide what our set of sensitivity and specificity is going to be, because the one is dependent on the other. The WHO, for screening purposes, have stated that a 90% sensitivity and a 70% specificity should be the target for screening for tuberculosis. So what this enables us to do, and the 90% sensitivity line is a bit misplaced, is to find the point on the curve. So now we're down to the point on the curve at which we can identify the set, the pair really, of sensitivity and specificity that meets the criterion. In this case, sensitivity at 90%, more or less approximate. And you can see what happens to the 3 curves. If you set at 90%, curve A, that's vendor A, was able to achieve the WHO target. B fell somewhat below, although 60%, further development of specificity, 60% might allow for further development, and the 3rd fell out of contention altogether. So to conclude, we need appropriate and repeated validation studies. We need relevant context, relevant threshold. There may be other contexts in which you would use different different criteria, and that's what I mean about context dependent. Maybe sensitivity might be less relevant, and you want greater specificity. We need to evaluate the operational utility in practice, and we need not more experience with that. And we talked about occupational setting. I'm not aware of the use of CAD in the general public health setting for TB diagnosis. May be coming, yet to be tested. So a lot more to do. Thanks very much. Sorry, I had to speed up there to try and catch up. And there are some references for the work that's already been published. Mohammed, sorry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rodney, for that sterling expose of the work that you have been doing with other colleagues. The floor is now open for questions. Rodney, there's a question in the chat from one of our registrars. Does period, I'll read it out to you. It says, does period of exposure to silica dust matter for one to be at high risk of TB while controlling for other confounders such as age, HIV?
Duration of exposure. Yeah, so in fact, so if you look at, sorry, it went very quickly, but if you look back at it, you'll see that at least 3 of the studies used period of exposure, controlling for not everything, but certainly age was always controlled. HIV, I think, was controlled in those studies, and they indeed found an association between duration and TB risk.
Thank you. There's a hand. Tony Hawkridge, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Mohammed, and thank you, Rodney. It's kind of tangential, but about 20 years ago, we were trying to do CAD for pediatric tuberculosis, and we took it to, and I can't even remember who was working with us, but they eventually came back and said it's too difficult because the radiological signs were just too ambiguous and whatever. Do you know if there's been any further work on that? Because it's a really difficult radiological diagnosis to make, even though everybody thinks they can make it.
Yeah, not for peds, Tony. But you know what the example I think of is chess. You know, when they started with chess, I can't remember what it's called. The Grandmasters thing prevailed right in the beginning. Is that right?
Yeah.
And now I think the Grandmasters have absolutely no chance against the against the system. So I think in the early days for CAD, it's mysterious because, you know, we really struggle as radiologists struggle. And so the question is whether the best that human radiologists can do represent a cap on what AI can do, or whether AI can go further. I can't answer that question.
Thanks, Rodney.
Thank you, Rodney. There is a hand from Pudigupta. Would you like to ask your question? Unmute, please.
Okay, hi, thanks for the great presentation. And unless if I just missed this, on the first meta-analysis, what was the population? Is it implicitly implied for males or a combination of males and females?
I think, no, you're right, it is implicitly male, certainly in mining. I think the Taiwanese study was actually a renal failure register. You'll have to go look and see how it's possible but they had silicosis and they had TB. I think that was the only study. I think the study by Li is the only one that had women as well. But I presume most of the silicosis is among men because women are certainly in the heavy. Certainly in mining and obviously underrepresented, although the numbers in South Africa or the proportion of women in mining underground is increasing. Dr. Belfour's on the meeting be able to comment on this. It could be as high as 10%, and silicosis is starting to appear in women. But you know, it's taken a long time to build up the high exposures and therefore the outcomes among men, because silicosis takes a long time to appear. Certainly, it's a question mark worth watching.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Rodney. Tutula, would you like to comment on the participation of women in the mining industry?
Thanks, Mohammed. At present, we are on about 13% of women, of the population in mining is women. So most of the studies that were done were far earlier, so it would mostly just be men, really. Thanks.
Thank you. And then we obviously must remember non-mining populations like ceramics and other industries where there may be women also participating in those industries. I see a hand from Anibal. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Prof, a quick question regarding the study on diagnosis, the automatic system. But the vendor, did the vendor provide the system already trained and you apply their system, or did you use your sample to train the system?
That's a very good question. So key question. So for tuberculosis, they were already trained. In other words, the tuberculosis market is global, and I think at least 2 of the companies were international, if not 3. There's one South African company, which is, yeah. So it's a struggle, as they will tell you, because they need to get access. Silicosis is new. So in the first study, I think they were provided with silicosis images, all 3 companies, and I think they may have got some images from elsewhere. But interestingly enough, by the time we got to the second study, 2 of the companies indicated that they could not, I didn't present those data, they could not, they decided that they could not claim to be able to detect silicosis. So we're really back to the one long-standing company. They need thousands of images to train the system on. I think that it's very early days for silicosis.
Thank you. Vanessa, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Prof. Xray and Prof. Rodney on the excellent presentation. I'm sorry I joined a bit late. Just a comment on a comment and a question. My comment is on female South African mine workers. It is true there have not been sufficient studies done, especially on the occupational lung diseases. But one study comes to mind, I think it was 2 years ago, where it was headed up by, I think it was, I'm sorry about this, Prof. Murray and some of the pathologists, yes, at the National Institute for Occupational Health, based on the PATHOR database. And what they found, if I remember correctly, was that silicosis in women miners, female miners, were found in these autopsy cases after very short employment, very short duration of exposure, which meant that, you know, there was inadequate dust control. But I think the study did not go further to define whether, or to explore whether women experienced shorter durations of contract of exposure and had manifested disease sooner than men. So I think that's still a question that's up. But my question for Prof. Ehrlich is around coal workers' pneumoconiosis. Is there any evidence, firstly, for the predisposition increased risk for TB, and also as regards the subradiological coal workers' pneumoconiosis, and maybe CAD could be, you know, a solution for this detection as well of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which I think we really battle in the industry in diagnosing it and compensating for it, including its association with TB. Was that clear?
Yeah, so coal miners have been understudied in this country. It was a later industry and not heavily dependent on migrant labor. They recruited locally, and I think conditions were generally better. So I don't know what the prevalence, and there's been some work on silicosis, but my understanding from things I've seen or presentations over the years that they have lower TB rates. Actually, Dr. Balfour will be able to, lower TB rates generally in coal mining workforces. I'm not aware of any study trying to relate exposure or coal mine dust exposure to tuberculosis, but you know, if it contains silica, then in theory there should be some risk. It may be too much noise in the system, but it is a question. With regard to CAD, coal miners' appearance lung on the X-ray varies. It can look exactly like silicosis, so there should be no reason why CAD shouldn't detect it. But you know, if you wanted to pick up specifically the spectrum of coal miners' lung variation, the system would have to be trained on coal miners' X-rays, and I'm not aware, I haven't seen anything on that.
Thank you, Rodney. I'm going to allow 2 more questions. I see there's a person whose identity is called IMAC new. Would you like to ask your question? And then I suspect David Rees is using Susan's account. David, you can go thereafter. Thanks.
So that was me, the IMAC new.
Ah, okay.
I haven't figured out how to change that name. Apologies for that. So I wanted to say that I found the first part very interesting, and I've always wondered here whether silicosis is in fact an intermediary variable between silica exposure and TB, or whether there's a completely independent relationship between the two, between silica exposure and both of those diseases. And it seems to me that your findings have come down on the latter, on the second, the latter reality or possibility or causal route, which I think is very good. And I think bolstered by that subradiological information, you know, it really provides something quite unusual, unusually important, I would say, given the whole compensation situation, where I think it's been very convenient for the mining industry to try and in fact minimize compensation possibility by insisting on having silicosis first. And of course, by the time you've got silicosis, you will have had a lot of exposure to silica, and hence your tuberculosis outcome would be, would be worse, going along those lines. But I think I also had a question. Sorry, there was a comment. I'm not sure whether you'd agree with that or not. And I also have a quick question: is anybody looking at the construction industry looking at the construction industry for silicosis and TB?
Okay, Johnny, so the industry is represented here. I'm not sure if construction was one of them specifically. I mean, some of them were general registers. I think the Hong Kong study was a general register, and they definitely have construction workers in that register, but I don't think it's a specific focus on the industry. South African studies, which I'd suppose the most comprehensive, most focused in on the question, all mining. So I think there's a gap, particularly in poorly regulated areas where there's poor regulation, poor surveillance, and therefore poor data. The biological evidence is almost all about, sorry, come back to a question about mediation, is almost all about dust and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's very difficult to reproduce silicosis in the laboratory, unless you're going to have, as they used to do for baboons and asbestos, animals sitting there, getting silicosis over the years, which can be then tested for, in this case, another disease, tuberculosis. It's difficult to reproduce a model in the laboratory in which fibrosis is a primary agent, as it were. But if you just look at the dust MTB evidence, it's pretty convincing from a number of studies of small animals, and now, as I say, in vitro studies, I suppose macrophages. There's definitely, it points to a very specific mechanism in the blocking of the body's defense mechanisms against MTB. In other words, allowing MTB to proliferate. So I think the question of what it's really, I suppose one has to remain undogmatic. It's open, but it's certainly consistent with an effect of dust in promoting TB, and silicosis being a marker of high dust levels plus host susceptibility, but not itself being a requirement, because it's not clear theoretically what about fibrosis is a requirement for tuberculosis. I mean, there's something called SCAR. Is there something called SCAR TB? I mean, I think non-silicosis. There's some suggestion that scarring, people who've had scarred lungs, maybe increase the risk of TB. So there might be something along those lines. But otherwise, I think I'd go with the evidence as it points in a somewhat different direction.
Thank you. And then our last question before we round up from David Rees. David.
Thanks very much, everybody. Really enjoyed the session. The question whether women get silicosis at shorter durations of exposure than men is important. It has implications for the occupational exposure standards and other implications, and as more and more women enter the industry, the question becomes more important. And there are some theoretical reasons why they might, but just to comment on the NIOH study, they did find that women at autopsy with silicosis had shorter exposure than men, But remember that the whole population had short exposure. So there were no long service women. So simply by the nature of the population, all of them with silicosis had to have had short exposure. So it didn't answer that question. I just wanted to make that point because, yeah.
Thank you, David, for that. I think at the risk of losing folks, I'm going to now end the session and thank Rodney for that excellent presentation, and thank you all for participating and contributing by asking your questions. They have been very useful. What we will do is ask Rodney to circulate his reference with regard to his systematic review. And since this session is being recorded, we will also circulate the link for this should you wish to share it, or should you wish to see it if you've missed any parts thereof. Thank you, Rodney, and thank you to all for coming in and listening to this presentation.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks, everybody.
All the best. Bye.
Bye. Safe.
Rodney, bye.